Class Lecture Module 4, How to Apply Systems Thinking and Systems Integration to Nexus Analysis, How to See the Synergies. We could have called the course the Ph3 Nexus, F-E-W-W, Ph3 Nexus, wherein the acronym FEWW stands for Food, Energy, Water, and Waste. This would be logical given that the waste problem, from air and water pollution to land contamination and landfills, is one of the gravest threats facing humanity. It would also be consistent with the opinion of Dr. Ahmed Belhoul, the CEO of Masdar City, the experimental prototype community of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the Arab EPCAD, perhaps, who said, quote, "When people think of sustainability, they tend to focus on the water, energy, food nexus, but waste is a critical part of the equation. Dumping waste in landfills is not desirable, so finding innovative ways to release the embodied energy in waste is crucial if we are to address the sustainability challenges of increased urbanization and consumerism." End quote. And he is right. Why didn't we call this the Ph3, F-E-W-W, Nexus? We chose not to include waste because, well, we want to eliminate waste. And if you're going to do that, get rid of it entirely, why would you retain a word for it? We want to convince you and the rest of the world that there is no such thing as waste. And if there's no such thing, then there can't be a word for it. In fact, using a word somehow conjures it into being. It's like speaking an evil into existence. And waste is, to those who suffer and die from its effects, evil. Perhaps the fact that we defined materials that could have been repurposed back into the Nexus cycle as waste was a huge part of the problem to begin with. A systems thinker would never do that. A systems thinker would use a word, a noun, that defined the new function in the system. Systems thinking is a way of looking at the world that is multidimensional in both time and space. It combines the best of the ways scientists look at the world and the ways artists look at the world. Inherently creative, it takes a playful look at things and brings out the inner child in the sandbox, responding to every challenge with imagination. Remember the old joke, when is a door not a door? Answer, when it is ajar. Such wordplay isn't trivial. A systems thinker, faced with only an old door and needing a container to hold something, would fashion a jar out of the leftover wood, just as our primitive ancestors would look at a tree and see a door or a dugout canoe or a guitar. The ability to constantly rename things as you see fit and fit objects used for one purpose into a totally new reality is part of systems thinking. Another part is seeing how novel combinations of objects and patterns and purposes creates entire systems whose whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. For a systems thinker, there could never be any such thing as waste because everything can be conceived to have a purpose in some system. Seem esoteric? Certainly, systems thinking can be applied to any of the arts and sciences and to business and law and every other system. Want to know how to directly relate these concepts to the Ph3 Nexus? Fortunately for us, there is a wide body of literature on systems thinking that does just that. I didn't know it until I was long into adulthood, but it turns out I was always attracted to the writings of the people that Donella Meadows has recently dubbed, quote, the natural systems thinkers in the Ph3 Nexus. Though they never used a computer, she says, to run a simulation and did most of their thinking before the concept of systems thinking became trendy, they set the groundwork for the rich tapestry of systems integration scholarship that has emerged in the decades since. Meadows herself was one of them, and started the science of using computer simulation to model the Earth's life support systems so that we could begin to see and think about their interrelationships in new ways. Limits to Growth came out when I was 10 years old in 1972, 2 years after I had participated in the first Earth Day and had developed my lifelong passion for environmental science as an elementary school student. So it became part of my DNA as I embarked on my educational journey through middle school when the book came out, and throughout high school and on into college and graduate school. The luminaries who most influenced me were also heroes of my mother and father, who were a college psychology and sociology professor and an investigative journalist, respectively. My mother and father introduced me to scientist Gregory Bateson via Margaret Mead, the anthropologist whom he was married to, and on my bedroom bookshelf they placed a copy of his seminal Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which blew my mind. Next to it, they had a copy of V.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, which said it all. framing the approach I would take for the rest of my life as I struggled to find the appropriate scale of my own interventions and implementations of what Schumacher called appropriate technology. From these two works, the stage was set for me to develop an enduring interest into the works of Kenneth Boulding, Herman Daly, Albert Einstein, Garrett Hardin, Václav Havel, Lewis Mumford, and Gunnar Myrdal, to name just a few. The more I read and studied their thinking, the more infused I became with the tenets of systems thinking and started thinking that way myself. And now it almost feels natural. I can't imagine not thinking in terms of overlapping, imbricated, rhizomally connected systems. I can't help seeing both the forest and the trees in Necker cube fashion, obsessed with flip-flopping perspectives and scales, zooming in and out, going from micro to macro and everywhere in between to tease a new relationship into focus, the way I used to play with the dials and objectives on a light microscope, hunting for interesting arthropods and body parts and cell organelles and microbes up and down the three-dimensional layers in every sample of pond water. Today, systems thinking is a discipline unto itself and a vital one for Nexus thinking, because, of course, Nexus thinking is systems thinking. Let me repeat that. Nexus thinking is systems thinking, applied here to the articulations between food, energy, and water, and, of course, the waste that we seek to eliminate through our understanding of systems so that we can stay within the planetary boundaries so that we don't exceed our limits to growth. But its genesis came from the coming together of those seminal thinkers whose works I recommend you too dive into during those heady days just after the first Earth Day raised awareness of our need to stay within the confines of one Earth. Donella Meadows was a leader of this thought process, helping to formalize it, to computerize it, to realize it, and to universalize it. In 1993, she wrote that systems thinking developed from the sparks that flew as ideas smashed together from among the great thinkers I mentioned above, as well as, quote, a number of modern corporate executives and many anonymous sources of ancient wisdom, from Native Americans to the Sufi of the Middle East, end quote. She continued, quote, strange bedfellows, but systems thinking transcends disciplines and cultures, and when it's done right, it overarches history as well. Having spoken of transcendence, she said, I need to acknowledge factionalism as well. Systems analysts use overarching concepts, but they have entirely human personalities, which means that they have formed many fractious schools of systems thought. I have used the language and symbols of system dynamics here, Donella said, the school in which I was taught. And I present only the core of systems theories here, not the leading edge. I don't deal, she said, with the most abstract theories, and am interested in analysis only when I can see how it helps solve real problems. When the abstract end of systems theory does that, which I believe it will someday, another book will have to be written. Therefore, she said, you should be warned that this book, like all books, is biased and incomplete. There is much, much more to systems thinking than is presented here for you to discover if you are interested. One of my purposes is to make you interested. Another of my purposes, the main one, is to give you a basic ability to understand and to deal with complex systems, even if your formal systems training begins and ends with this book. End quote, Donella Meadows, 1993. Well, one of my purposes is also to make you interested and give you that basic understanding in the hopes that your training won't end with this book, and that is the subject of this video. In a very strong sense, systems thinking is a form of holism. Systems thinking is seen as the antithesis of the reductionism that dominated science. Quora.com has this to say about holism, the idea that, quote, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, end quote. Quora says, when viewing a situation or a problem or challenge, it is always good to firstly step back by taking a helicopter view or a gestalt perspective of it, end quote. This is also called taking a bird's eye view. Holism is at the core of systems thinking, but systems thinking is, of course, much more than that.